Now I would like to show you one of my best games, one of my best endgames, the game against Alexei Shirov, one of the world's best players, played in 2004 in Calvia Olympiad in Spain. So in this position, the endgame has arisen, and you see white has a better structure. That is, his pawns are stable, can also support each other, and black's pawns are broken and potentially weak. On the other hand, this structure can be very deceptive in middle game, because black can also control the square d4 and can sometimes in middle game create initiative on the king side and in the center where he has a pawn more. But here in the endgame that's why further important to exchange more pieces, so that the weakness of the pawns a6, c6 comes to the fore, and also using the fact that the knight is on b3, eyeing a very good square c5, it is useful to begin with the exchange of the bishops. So after bishop e3, black would normally like to take bishop e3, but in this particular position, after f takes e3, the pawn moving to e3 is not necessarily weakening white's position, because after king f2 it will be supported, and the pawn controls the square d4. And in my opinion, this is very important. Now knight f5 d4 is not an idea anymore, and white continues with knight c5, rook d1, and basically black would be not having much of counterplay. So after bishop e3, Shirov went king f8, and white goes rook d1. You see, white tries to exchange as many pieces as possible in order to obtain the real endgame kind of position, so as to be able to use the weaknesses of the pawns a6, c6. It is also important that white's minor pieces could become more active than their counterparts. But of course, all is not easy. Black took rook d1, king e8. Black used the time white was when white was developing to bring his king to the center. However, in this case, after bishop a7, rook a7, knight c5, we can already take some stock of what has happened. White is active, the black's pawns are weakened, and the king, although in the center, cannot be advanced much further because white controls the d file. Also, white's rook is more active than its counterpart on a7. Now, what is most important in this position is that the black's only counterplay is knight f5 d4, and if the knight were on d4, all this would have been different, and black would have had a normal position. So it is important to notice what is important for the position and to be able to take care of this particular aspect. So now the following next moves, white will be fighting against the idea of the black knight transferring to d4. So he goes knight f5, understandably. Now bishop g4 comes, pinning the knight so that it cannot advance any further. Now king e7. So in this position, white is active, white looks better, but he has to act quickly, because if nothing happens, then black would go a5, rook c7, knight d4, and would solve his problems. It is also important to note that although the rook is active on d1, after, for instance, bishop takes f5, it would have no squares of penetration, and thus after a5 and activization of the rook, black would be completely okay, despite of the fact that the knight looks strong on c5. In fact, it is in this position it is looking strong but not doing very much. So after king e7, you see the position, although it is a late endgame, the position is still sharp. White has to show some initiative, has to fight against black's ideas to transfer the knight to d4, and has to act quickly. So I go rook e1 in order to annoy the black's king a bit, and also create the threats of f4. After, for instance, f6, f4 would be unpleasant. Black uses this to activate his king, king d6, knight e4, And now you see that after king e7, I have additional trick using the pin of the knight. I go knight g3, and now I'm also attacking the pawn on e5. So a very dynamic play. So he goes king c7. The king is of course more or less centralized on c7 when compared to g8. On the other hand, it also has drawbacks of blocking the rook on a7, but one needs a very dynamic play in order to be able to use this. So I go c5. Normally, positionally speaking, this is a double-edged decision because the black bishop gets some new squares. On the other hand, white creates a very strong threat of taking on f5 and going knight d6 because e5 is hanging in the end, and black has to do something about it because, for instance, in this position, if black would go knight d4, and after bishop c8, king c8, knight d6, white would be winning the pawn on e5 for free and would be winning because of also the activity of his pieces. So black tries to go f6. Now it might look attractive to go bishop takes f5, bishop f5, knight d6, but still the knight on d6 is not creating as many threats as one would like. Black continues bishop e6, attacking the pawn, and then he might try to activate the rook on b8 and would be probably okay. So it is important to keep the threats alive. Black is still a bit discoordinated. So you see also in the endgame you can have very dynamic situations where the constant activity is required in order to break down the opponent's resistance, in order not to allow any counterplay. So I proceed with f4. Now I'm continuing to put pressure on the pawn on e5. And now you see if black would take, e takes f4, then white has a very strong move, knight d6, attacking f5, attacking c8, and now after knight takes d6, c takes d6. You see that black is losing material because if he goes king d8, then bishop c8, king c8, rook e8, followed by rook e7. For instance, after king b7, rook e7, king b6, takes d7, now the pawn queens. So you see it is also important to calculate lines in endgames, and after knight d6, white uses the tactical means in order to achieve what he wants to achieve, in this case to prevent black from fixing his knight on d4. Shirov still played knight d4, but now after exchanges, knight d6, king d7, rook a5, white won a pawn, and what is most important, the knight on d4 doesn't have support anymore. White won a pawn, and usually it is in an endgame like this at the end of story. Very often the books finish here saying and the rest is technique, but in fact exactly this technique we are trying to learn here, and it is very important not to relax after you win material and proceed in the same vein. Now we saw that white was very successful here in the game by creating constant threats to black's position, and in fact he continues to do this. He has three strong pieces, and the black king is vulnerable to all sorts of checks, so white continues to use his activity in order to annoy black's coordination and to be able to win more material or more positional advantage in order to make his realization possible. So after rook a8, I start by kicking the knight from d4, knight e6. Now the pawn is hanging, I go knight c4, creating some threats of my own. Now you see that if he takes knight c5, attacking the rook on e4, the knight b6 check will come, and if king c7, then knight a8 check, winning the rook. If king d6, then rook d4 check, king e5, rook c4. Now you see the rook is hanging and the knight is hanging with check, and black is losing material. For instance, after rook b8, rook takes, king d6, and knight a4, rook b4, rook a5. I had calculated that much before playing knight c4, so you see, even in the endgames, which are very favorable, it is very useful to calculate because it helps to control the game and to keep your positional advantage. So here after knight c4, black went king e7 and white goes b4. So all this calculation basically served to the fact that now white was able to fix the weaknesses on c6, on a6 using tactical means. You see that the knight on c4 and the pawn on b4 are basically making a5 impossible. Black still tries some desperate counterplay, rook d8, knight e5, and now c6 is hanging, and after rook c8, now after white was able to keep control of black's counterplay, now it's time to activate the king. You see white is both pawn up and more active, so he's bringing his king around, and black tries some counterplay, goes a5, knight d3, both protecting the pawn c5 and creating the threat of knight f4. So after king f6, ba5, now white is 2 pawns up, both of them are passed pawns, and after rook a8, white supports the passed pawn from behind, the strongest support possible, and after knight c7, king e3, king e6, white just remembers that he is in fact 2 pawns up and goes a6 with a simple idea that if black takes rook a6, and after rook a6, knight a6, goes king a4 followed by a4, and you see this is a knight ending, pawn up and the active king. This would be completely winning for white. In fact, black would not be able to put much resistance here because the a pawn is incredibly strong against the knight. So black tries knight b5, check, and a4. Now you see black is completely pushed off the board after something like knight c7, rook d4 check, followed by rook d6 check, rook takes c6 happens. You see white used all the possibilities in the position, tactical and strategical ones, to make this endgame winning. So in fact black resigned after a4. Now returning to summarize what we have learned from the game, I would like you to pay closest attention to the fact that sometimes it is necessary to fight for initiative at any cost, because the slow play would allow the opponent to activate his pieces and to make your positional advantage negligible. So in a position like this, white proceeded by creating threats every move, c5 and then f4, and calculating the lines precisely with precision till the very end. And this enabled me to win this game against this great opponent, Alexei Shirov, as you know, one of the world's best players, and I'm pretty sure that you will be capable of similar achievements if you will manage to take these lessons well and to learn to fight for initiative in the endgame. We proceed with some other examples.